I think we can start. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to YSE BIOMES, a weekly seminar series. Over the last 15 years, the Yale School of Environment has held this weekly seminar series, which we named BIOMES, and which has been a school flagship forum for bringing cutting-edge research and impactful work to the community. BIOMES stands for Bridging Issues and Optimizing Models in Environmental Studies. This week, we are joined by our own community members and faculty members, Brodersen, Howard and Maryan, Newman, Professor of Plant Physiology and Ecology, Yuan, Professor of Industrial Ecology and Sustainable Systems, and Reid, Lifest, Research Scholar, Resident Fellow in Industrial Ecology, and founding editor of Journal of Industrial Ecology. Yeah. To set some context, we begin this week. We are aiming to highlight and showcase how YSE researchers make use of machine learning and AI methods and tools. Professor Brodersen and Yuan will be sharing their experiences and expertise with moderation provided by Reid. With that, we'll welcome everyone and to the stage and we turn over to our panel. Yeah, Reid, over to you.
Thank you. Well, welcome everyone. We're going to keep this pretty informal. Let me start by saying, it's obvious why we should have a discussion of this. AI is accelerating rapidly through the economy, through policy, through research, whether it's to advance the research that we're doing or find new ways to do it or be more efficient or to worry about how it's being used, the right form of it. So what we're going to do today is hear from two faculty members who have been using AI and their experiences and draw some conclusions from that. We're going to leave time for question and answer, but we're going to have to leave the room at 5 minutes before 1 because there's a class coming in here. Let me just tell you why I'm here. So I'm involved in these issues from the point of view of asking what the environmental impact of digital technologies is. Will, can you switch the slide to the network? Maybe. So I'm one of the principals in a project that's been going on for about 5 years, along with University of California, Berkeley, and the Environmental Law Institute, to look at the impact of digital technologies and digitalization on the environment. And that has led me to become quite interested in this. So my interests extend beyond just AI, but obviously AI is a centerpiece. I've also, if you're interested, the website is just networkdee.org. I have also organized a lecture series here at the school on the digital economy and the environment. And there have been several talks that have been recorded, and there will be some more coming. Will, can you switch to the other screen? And that's where you can find that. So without taking up more time on this, why don't we get started? And Craig, can you talk about how you're using AI in your work?
Sure. So a lot of the work that we do in the lab is related to understanding the structure of plants and how that's related to its ultimate function, primarily within the context of this work in the AI, is finding more efficient ways of processing very large amounts of information. Can I put things up on there?
Please.
So I'm going to just share my screen, I think. All right. So this is a lot of this starts probably going back originally to about 2009. And one of the things that we do is try to get information about the structural properties of the inside of plants, in particular leaves and then stems, and understand how the organization of those cells is arranged to facilitate the movement of water, the absorption of light, to perform photosynthesis. And in order to do this, sort of historically, we would have used light microscope images to study the very thin sections that were taken from the inside of the plant and study those. The problem, though, is that plants are very three-dimensionally complex. And so a single two-dimensional image cross-section through a leaf, for example, doesn't give us the full three-dimensional structure. So what we do is we go out to a facility. There's probably maybe 10 or 12 of these facilities in the world. It's at the Lawrence Berkeley National Lab. It's a particle accelerator facility that allows us to do high-resolution X-ray imaging, which is based on the same principles as a medical CAT scan or CT scan, but at a much higher magnification, and it allows us to scan these pieces of tissue much more quickly. Originally, the bottleneck was the instrument itself, and it just took a long time to do these scans so that we could get a digital image, a three-dimensional digital image of the inside of the plant tissue that we were interested in. Over the past about 10 years, a lot of the image capture and image transfer and image storage capabilities improved to the point where now the bottleneck is basically the image processing side, where instead of just looking at maybe a handful or a dozen cross sections underneath a light microscope, now we're dealing with thousands and thousands and thousands of images, and we just don't have the capacity to physically do this all by hand, measuring all the interesting traits that we're interested in. And so what we want is basically a spatial and volumetric data set from the segmented parts of the image, and I'll talk about what that means in a second. And then the other goal was that it was an open source platform where we're using ImageJ, and then we're also using Python and releasing our code publicly so that people can actually use this. And a lot of what we've been doing and developing is based on image processing pipelines, machine learning algorithms that have been developed in the medical industry for processing large volumes of medical images in an efficient way. And basically why we want to do this is because this diffusive pathway, so the inside of the leaf is composed of cells and composed of air. And how that CO2 diffuses through the leaf is directly influences the photosynthesis and then ultimately yield. So if we can understand how the inside of leaves are constructed, we might be able to figure out ways of constructing them more efficiently. The primary challenges for us is that, as a lot of you know, for these large language learning models, is that they have massive training libraries, right? So where ChatGPT is basically scrubbed the internet for all of this information and sort of put it together. Our challenge is that we don't have that large training library. It's non-existent, and so we have to basically make it ourselves. And that creating those training libraries is really tedious. So it takes, on average, maybe to generate a training library for something that we're working on. It might take a day or 2 days in order to manually go through and annotate micro CT cross section that we could then feed into one of these models to do it. So we've got a huge data set composed of billions and billions of grayscale pixels. We've got a heterogeneous tissue and air matrix that is difficult. There are computational constraints that we've tried to overcome. And then there's issues with pixel intensity as well. And so a lot of this, we started out probably in 2015, right shortly after I got here, with 2 postdocs, Mason Earls, who's there on the left, and then Guillaume on the right. Mason is now, he was a postdoc here. Then he worked on a lot of this image processing, machine learning developing these machine learning algorithms to basically go from these grayscale images of the inside of leaves to basically creating these sort of exploded parts diagram of the inside of the leaf, separating the leaf tissue from the airspace, from the vein network, to allow us to study the three-dimensional complexity of the tissue that's inside. Mason was then hired by Apple to work on their 3D data processing team, and then he actually left Apple and then is now at UC Davis doing this type of thing full time. And his lab is really interesting. So he's an assistant professor out there at UC Davis, and they're using AI for all sorts of different things. So looking at crop yield forecasting from satellite images, looking at plant and food pathogen detection, and then also using this to do plant trait measurements like we do in our lab here. And so this is on the upper left-hand corner is sort of an example of one of the images that we get. We can convert that into sort of a three-dimensional volumetric rendering of the inside of the leaf. And then now we're at the point where we have close to 200 different species where we have leaf scans, over 100 terabytes of data sitting on the server here over in Sage, I guess. And we're looking at 2 million individual cross sections, right? So that's way more than one person could go through in a lifetime trying to process all this information. So we've done a bunch of work, and I'm not going to sort of belabor the point, but going through and figuring out how to basically train the software in plant anatomy, right? So teaching the computer plant anatomy and then figuring out ways to identify the different parts of the inside of the leaf that we're interested in a much more efficient way, and basically going from these grayscale images to actual values that we want that tell us something about the inside of the leaf. And then specifically recent work with this guy here, Devin Ripner, has sort of advanced this even further, where it took a few hours to a few days to do sort of an individual scan and run it through one of these models. And now Devin has been working on developing these computational or convoluted neural networks using remote GPUs that are hosted at Google, for example, as a way to facilitate and speed this up, going from hours to minutes, for example, that allows us to speed through this and work in a much more efficient way. There's a couple of quotes from this paper that they recently published that I think that are really great. There's a disconnect between the computer scientists and the engineers who build these AI and ML tools and the potential end users in agricultural research who may be unsure of how to apply these tools to their work, right? So there's a lot of people in the computer science world, right, that understand this coding, and then there's other people that are doing the agricultural work or the type of work that we're doing, and the skill sets often don't overlap. So finding someone like Mason or Devin is great because they have both, right? So they understand the plant anatomy and the physiology, and then they also understand how to work with these computer models. One of my main challenges is maintaining those, keeping those people here in the lab instead of being lured away to places like Apple, which can pay much more than I can for a postdoc salary, for example. So we've done all this, bunch of different work. This is some work from Alika Borsuk, who was a YSE PhD student who is working with these machine learning models to basically pull apart the leaves, and so we can show them sort of what's on the inside of a leaf. And we can peer inside and we can get these really nice visualizations, and we can also do all the data analysis that tells us sort of what's going on. And then most recently, we've been working on leaf vein networks, right? And so this morning, I asked ChatGPT, running in Clarity, to generate some models of leaves. And sort of we're interested in the networks there, the vein networks of the leaf, right? So none of those leaves are real. And you start to go in and probe and ask ChatGPT or the other models that are running in Clarity where they get their information from. And it's a little bit difficult to dig in and get there. I asked it to generate 5 different ginkgo leaves, and then I put in one that is real. So can you figure out which one is real? Any guesses? Anybody want to be brave and guess? So 5 are fake and 1 is real. You think the top middle is correct? Anybody else? Bottom right? Top left? Kind of all over the place. Bottom right is a botanical abomination, right? So that is completely not right. We'll narrow it down to these 2. Which one do you think it is?
I just want to know if that's a technical term.
They're a botanical abomination. Yeah, for me it is. Any ideas which one is real? The left one or the right one? I think the right one. No, it's actually the one on the left. Right, so somebody did guess the one, and it comes from this image, which is part of the cleared leaf image database, right? So it's good enough. So I think this maybe opens up some potential discussion points where it's good enough to maybe fool the general public. I would be, if I was presented with those, completely naive. I'm seeing Marlies, like she's sort of not, it's borderline. And so what I'm finding, at least in sort of generating these images and thinking about how to potentially artificially generate leaf networks and sort of understand how they behave, is it can do some really interesting things, really impressive things, but it still takes sort of an understanding and a formal training in how plants are put together to understand when it's not quite right. right? And that goes for both the coding development that we've been working on. And this is an example here of where I asked it to take that image of the ginkgo leaf, right, and extract a network diagram of the leaf, and then try to simulate how water would flow through that network if a particular node in that network was disrupted. And it gives me all the code, right? So that's the code on the right-hand side that I generated in about 15 minutes this morning. And it does reasonably well. If you start to ask it to do other leaf networks, it really starts to struggle with more complex network modeling. And some of this is obviously wrong. The x-axis and y-axis units are completely not based in reality. And so some of these images are completely bogus and don't mean anything and would potentially confuse you. And there's even words sort of in this image up here, sort of in the labels of the images that I don't know where it actually came from. So I think that's for me, that's one of the big parts of this, where it's a little bit difficult to know where to go too deeply with this without understanding what's actually going on underneath. The code I can read the Python code, I can understand how that works, and I can see what it's doing. But then there's this other sort of area where it's disconnected from reality. So that's sort of how we're using it, and sort of where we're going, and kind of where we're treading a bit carefully, I think, at the moment.
So what processes do you use to try and, you have some images or some output that's obviously wrong, but the problem is the stuff that's not so obvious. What process do you use to try and check that?
So I had a conversation with ChatGPT this morning about that question, right? And so, where do you get your images from? And I asked it to generate a sassafras leaf, right? And it could not do it. I uploaded an image of a sassafras leaf, and I said, make this image. And it was just this back and forth for about 10 minutes of me trying to convince it to make the image that I wanted, and it would not do it. And I switched over, this is all running on Clarity, switched over to Claude and asked it to do it, and it came up with slightly different results, but it was also unable to do it. So there's something about the training image data set that it's working with, and even if I give it a very specific image to work with, there's a disconnect and I would assume that it's going to get better. But I think the real important point is that you still need to have some background information about how all this stuff works. And I think that's where it gets really difficult, especially as an early career scientist, in how much of this do you trust?
How about with the machine learning and the step where you're using the Python code? Do you do anything to try and verify those results?
That's code that I can copy and I can run it, right? And I can see what the outputs are and see if it matches up with what it's doing. And we do, I use it all the time for coding in R, for example, and doing statistics. And again, it tells me step by step exactly what it's doing, how it's, and its thought process. And I can go through and check, and it says it's running some very particular statistical test. I need to know what that test means, right? And what it's actually doing with the data, and to be confident that what it's outputting in the end is something that I can trust. So it accelerates, I think, the process of analyzing our data, but at the same time, you still need to have a deep understanding of what it's actually doing.
So one question from my side of this work, is there any information provided to you about the energy use or carbon output of either the Lawrence Livermore LLM or the one here?
So I asked ChatGPT that question this morning. So I said, we've been chatting together for about an hour and a half. How much energy did that consume? And it said something like 50 to 200 watts or something like that. I wasn't 100% sure, but it sort of directed me to some resources where I could do those types of calculations. I think in terms of the computational resources, it either happens that the actual image processing and doing all of that work and that full pipeline is occurring either in our lab up at Greeley, and it's now gotten to the point where we have this gigantic data set, and we're sort of trying to figure out what's the most efficient way of processing it. So right now, if I have a scan of an individual leaf, and it might be 5 millimeters squared or something like that, so it's a very small amount. That's 5 to 10 gigabytes of data. If you were to multiply that, if you wanted to scan an entire maple leaf, for example, that would be on the order of 80 to 100 terabytes of data, which is, I would say, probably technically possible, but computationally just sort of an intractable problem at the moment. And then you would need to start to think about what are the the energy costs of doing that, and sort of what are the cost benefit analysis of actually doing this type of research, right? So I don't know where I quite fall on that question yet, but it would be it would be nice to be able to see sort of, all right, if you run this process and if you run this model on this entire data set that we have now, what would the actual energy costs be?
Yeah, that gets pretty complicated because you also have to look at the embedded carbon in the supply chain. And based on the Yale cooling conference last week, you also have to ask about refrigerant losses, since they're very strong, have a very high global warming potential. Yuan, do you have any questions for Craig before we?
I think some issues Craig mentioned, like very hard to really verify how this model really generate this output is a common challenge. So actually that's lead towards when I'm going to talk about my research. So I can save that part.
All right.
Yeah.
So how about, we're going to have more Q&A at the end, but any quick questions for Craig before we move on? Your turn.
Okay, that's a very fast transition. Yeah, so I don't have any slides since we don't work on an image, but mostly data. And we mostly use machine learning in my project related to the biochar. So biochar is a very carbon-rich material, and they store carbon in a very stable form. So if you are familiar with the carbon market, you may have heard this biochar, right? This topic. It's getting increasingly popular in the currently carbon offset market. You can apply biochar to agricultural land or soil amendment. They contain a lot of carbon, so they can also burn as the energy sources. We are very interested in the environmental burdens associated with the biochar and also effectiveness of when you apply the biochar to the soil. And there are a lot of variables affect those. For example, what type of the biomass you use to produce biochar. They can be produced from all kinds of trees, grass, or even those waste generated by us human beings or animals. And if you produce them in different way and apply those biochar to different type of the soil under different environment, the effectiveness can be different. So if we do those assessments for a system with a lot of variations using traditional method like life cycle assessment, it's going to need a lot of data. And many times it's very hard to find those data. So fundamentally, we use those mechanistic models, which means we model those processes based on our fundamental understanding of chemistry or how this biochar is produced. But for using those models, they still need some input data that usually need to be collected from very time-consuming experimental work. And there are a lot of papers also published on that. So we use machine learning and train those machine learning models based on those experimental data from people already published. So when we have a new biomass coming in, or when we want to produce our biochar in a different environment, we can use our machine learning model to predict some input, but the major part we're still using our mechanistic model, which we have very good understanding of how they works. So that's kind of a related to your question, like say, many times we don't know how this machine learning model really generates our output, so we only use them to model some part where we simply do not have enough data for the new biomass we want to predict, but the major part we still model them using those mechanistic model where we understand the principles. So now, like my student Hannah, who's sitting there, she's working on this machine learning project. We are able to actually predict what are the potential environmental impact if you want to using any kind of biomass in the world to produce a biochar and apply biochar to any kind of a region in the world that have a specific condition with soils. And we want to scale up this model to do some global analysis. So if we use the model we already developed mechanistically to run this analysis, it's going to be very computational intensive. It's run very slow. So another way we use machine learning is we run some scenarios using our traditional modeling approach, and now we use machine learning to develop surrogate models, which they basically serve as a mini simulator of those more complicated model we already developed. So then we use this machine learning model to run this global analysis much, much faster. than we just run our traditional models thousands or millions of times. So those are two major ways we currently use in our project. One is to use them to predict the data that's a very time consuming by using the traditional experimental approach. The second one is using them to develop a surrogate model for our traditional model that take a very long time to run. And Reid also asked me, say, whether I can talk about whether we use the regenerative AI. We did use them when we needed some ideas of a design image or figures. But as Craig, you mentioned, sometimes their image generated always have some errors. So we only ask ChatGPT to help us generate some ideas, but we still plot those images or draw those images by ourselves because they never got it right. But they are very good help with brainstorming. Like when we have a data set or when we have ideas, say, I want to have some, like, for example, cover art of my article like this. I put in the test, put in some idea, and they can try to visualize some possible ideas. And we choose one, and we still design those images by ourselves. So those are several ways we use in current our research project.
So there's talk in the literature that for some creative work like you're doing, scientifically creative work, that hallucination is valuable and that the models can actually be adjusted in terms of what's called temperature to make them a little wilder to get some more innovative ideas. Have you tried that?
I tried to ask some question about industry ecology,
Good.
but the idea they gave me, I'm pretty sure either somebody already done or have studied it before. They haven't come up with some idea. I say, oh, I have never studied it before. So, but I only tried it in my field. I don't know about the other field, which may be good, right? That means we industry ecologists, we're still smarter than this.
Let's repeat that. Can you talk about your new, the new project you just got funded?
Yes, we still have funding now. Hopefully, we also get a funding for the following year because it's from the National Science Foundation. So we got a very big project with many computer scientists and also electrical engineer from other universities like Harvard, Princeton. And we really try to understand the environmental burdens of using AI. And hopefully, we can identify those strategies to design AI itself more sustainable. So for me, I'm majorly in charge of developing those life cycle assessment model and also carbon accounting models for those AI algorithms, but also for those hardware system that's used to support AI. For example, Craig, you mentioned like how much gigabyte of those data. Many of them need to store it on some place, like data center. We need a lot of hardware devices, like those batteries, those computers, those servers. And they use a lot of resources like rare earth metals, lithium in those batteries, or even sand like silicon in those chips. And when we have increasing demand of AI, what is increasing is not just energy, but all the natural resources and the materials used to manufacture those hardware and used to support the people who use AI. So if we really want to say in the future, we want AI to support our sustainable development goal, we need to understand what's the environmental burden associated with AI itself. And I think there's another interesting question is whether we really need to use AI to solve every problems we have, right? Because if there are some question or problems can be solved without using AI by using maybe environmentally cheaper solutions, maybe we can avoid using a lot of AI-related stuff that's also, of course, a lot of unexpected environmental burdens.
There's some very interesting discussions emerging in the literature about when we don't need so much accuracy or precision coming out of these models, that computer scientists, of course, want it to be the very best, but it may not be needed, and there may be an environmental dividend in figuring that out.
Yeah.
How about, Craig, any questions for Yuan?
Well, no, I think the idea that you brought up about the models sort of hallucinating is an interesting one, because when I look at those images, many of them look very, very real to me, and it's that makes sense because it's built on some it's scrubbed the internet for some thousands and thousands of images it leaves. One of the projects that we're working on right now is just sort of understanding how those leaf vein networks are put together. And you can ask ChatGPT to sort of simulate sort of a gradient of from very real to very abstract. And one of the things that we're trying to do is sort of figure out sort of this is the range of observable vein networks in nature. And we can start to test these ideas about, well, why don't these fantastical ones exist, right? So sort of pushing beyond the boundaries of what nature has sort of provided is one way that we're doing that. Certainly, we could go in by hand and sort of draw out what these vein networks actually look like and these distribution systems. But then there's something to be said about sort of just having generated automatically for us. Yeah, I don't know if I think what's very opaque to most people using it are these sort of these costs, right? Both in terms of energy and then the other resources that go into it. And so without having that sort of very transparent, how much are we talking about? It becomes very difficult to determine when to use it and when to not.
That's really important. I'm really glad you had this project. I've been doing a bibliometric study, this literature, and there's a couple really big blind spots. As far as I can tell, there's no serious research on the impact of the diesel backup generators on site of data centers, and there's very little on water use, and I think there's no environmental research on refrigerant leakage from the cooling system. So there are some chunks there that you're not going to get by just figuring out how much energy you're using at the plug on your servers.
So, and that's something that we could, potentially measure if we're doing all the work on our lab and the computers. But we've now with this new system that we've developed with Devin Ripner, we're basically we don't need the fancy computer in our lab anymore. It's just all hosted with Google. Yeah. And so we're just making the assumption that Google is doing the right thing.
Google always does the right thing.
In terms of energy use and the way that they're running their data centers. But doing that basically allows some of this to be possible where it wouldn't be possible for us to do it either here or maybe have enough time on the supercomputer here on campus. But these resources are now freely available, at least to a certain extent, or for a relatively low monthly subscription fee to run everything on Google's servers and GPUs.
But you have, I guess you could call it the advantage that you don't have a latency problem. You don't need an instantaneous answer. And so, some of the providers are doing things where they're changing the time of day of the calculations to when there's less energy impact.
Yeah. So most of the time we just set it up to run Friday afternoon and then come back and it's, Monday morning and it's ready to go. So it doesn't really matter to us when it happens.
Before we move on, question for Yuan. All right. Wait for a mic.
I have a question for Dr. Yuan. It's very impressive you used the surrogate model. It's kind of like to model for global scale. My question is, I think you used this surrogate model to represent the mechanistic model, right? But sometimes, like for example, neural network, it's very hard to find the physical meaning of those neurons. I wonder how you used this surrogate model to represent the mechanistic models.
Yeah. So the reason that we want to use a mechanic model at the first place is always because we want to make sure we model something we understand from fundamental mechanism. Like specifically, we model the pyrolysis process, which is a process to produce the biochar. And we model that's based on our fundamental understanding of pyrolysis chemistry. And how we develop a surrogate model is basically we run those mechanistic models so many times, we generate the input and output. And then we use those input and output data to train a machine learning model that purely can predict the output after we validate the output by using our mechanistic model. So the purpose of develop a surrogate model, as I mentioned before, is just in order to run faster. We are not trying to expect the surrogate model is able to represent the fundamental principle that we have used in our mechanistic model. So that is why we don't worry too much on that part, but just in order to use those surrogate model to run faster. But we'll make sure the surrogate model can predict the output that as what we get from the mechanistic model where we understand the chemistry very well.
So I'd like to turn this a little bit to teaching. ways in which you use artificial intelligence in your teaching. Craig, you want to?
I think a lot of it is in developing code. Do actually encourage students to sort of collaborate with ChatGPT in developing our code to sort of analyze their data for the students. And I personally have found sort of that again, you really need to have a strong foundation in the underlying statistical methods that that it's using. But once you're there, instead of me sort of flailing around on the internet trying to find, searching through forums and things like that to try to find the exact way to make my axis labels a little bit bigger or something like that, it can be done in seconds instead of minutes. And I try to impress upon the students that yes, you need to know how to code in R. You need to know how to load in a data set and understand what everything is doing. But there's I think the advantage now, rather than spending literally hours searching for the right answer, the answer is at your fingertips. And so that's one thing to basically accelerate the process of getting to the point of having your data set and then turning it into something that is that you can actually use to start to do the interpretation and the analysis. Doing that. And then for exams is one of the other things. So I will take my midterm exams, for example, my final exam questions, and I'll run them through ChatGPT to see how well they do. And at the end of last semester, I'd say ChatGPT was probably a B+ student, right? And so one of the things that I've been encouraging students to do is it's for a midterm exam for one of my classes, it's a take-home. And so I can't, the expectation is that you wouldn't use ChatGPT, right? But I can't, it's unenforceable at the moment. And so what instead I've said, you may consult with ChatGPT and let me know what it says, because it's always a little bit different, right? Whenever you ask it multiple times. And then to critique that answer, right? And is it correct, right? Is it wrong? Because that actually forces the student to think about and wrestle with the problem, right? In a way that, all right, well, this is what it's telling me is correct, but is it actually correct? Or is it, technically correct for 80% of it, but there are some few minor details or some little details that it missed out on. And so that's, I think, using it as a tool and sort of understanding that it's out there, students have access to it, and rather than just sort of completely pushing it away, just sort of embracing the fact that it's there and then allowing them to sort of work with it as a collaborator in a way, and then critiquing the outputs.
Yuan?
Yeah, I think I used one very similar to Craig's, that is run the problem set in the exams through ChatGPT. And I also tell students we already run all of those through ChatGPT. So we tell students, say, you are okay to use ChatGPT for a grammar check, because we understand, especially there are many international students, those ChatGPT really help them to polish their language. We say, however, we already run all the problem in the ChatGPT, so we know what the answer will look like. So we encourage them to use them, just check grammar, but not to generate original answers to those questions. Another way I use those regenerative AI is to sometimes I ask them what are some ideas for active learning activities in the class, because my class is always like a number heavy. Like I ask a student to do the calculations, to use the software. I always want to add something fun that the student can engage with each other. In the past, I gathered this idea by talking to other faculty colleagues, and sometimes I get inspiration. And now when ChatGPT coming up, sometimes I would just throw them some, like, this is the situation, my student this year have those background, I want to do something about this problem, can you brainstorm some activities? And sometimes they come out very good activities. So students can be active, engage more in the class, which I find pretty useful.
So this makes you more isolated.
That's maybe.
Okay, let's open this up to questions. Anything, the research methods, the problems.
Hi.
Over there.
This question is for Professor Brodersen. Thank you so much to everyone on the panel. But you had mentioned that the background trainings of those who you are working with don't often overlap, whether they're coming from a coding background or an agricultural or ecological background. And so based on that, my question is, what is needed in your opinion to branch that gap?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, we have students, master's students, undergraduate students that we'll hire to bring into the lab to help with some of this image training. We can train a student within an afternoon about the different cell types that they need to highlight. And it's basically doing the training image data sets is fairly straightforward. It's just it's a grayscale image, and we know that these particular cells are epidermal cells, and these are the vascular system and other parts. And so we can, and that sounds okay just in an afternoon, but that obviously doesn't take into account the 18 to 20 something years of formal education that they had to that point, and then the fact that they're human. And because a lot of the images that you see, it's very obvious to us sort of what we're looking at. And so that part of the training doesn't necessarily take all that long. It's what we're looking for is students that have both the interest in sort of the botanical side of understanding what's going on, but then are also fluent in Python and other coding languages, and are sort of interested in this very applied type of project. And so a lot of 10 years ago, I never would have thought to put in, in a job description for a postdoc ad, that I would, want somebody that was fluent in Python, right? Because that's, we were doing mostly physiological measurements and anatomical measurements and things like that, and we just weren't presented with this problem. But the accessibility of the data now, and the fact that a lot of this is, these projects are actually possible now, if you have the right people in the lab to do it. So it's a combination of finding people that are interested in the project, find it intellectually compelling and interesting, and then also having the funding to do it. So that's, again, one of the biggest issues, is that a lot of the people that are interested in these problems, there are other people that would like to hire them as well. So unless they're sort of strictly interested in staying within the academic pipeline, then it's often tricky to find those people and retain them.
Other questions? Oh, come on. Wait for the mic.
Hi, this is for Dr. Brodersen also. I just am curious why use Python over R, because I feel like Python is more like for industry and R is more academic.
Yeah, that's a good question. So a lot of what we're doing, again, is based on things that other people have done, and that's been developed for the medical image industry, for example. So, there are things that Python are a little bit better in doing in terms of the image processing side. So it's just sort of, there's a couple of different choices that we had to make along the way to make this possible in R versus possible in Python. One could port everything over and do it that way. And a lot of it is also based on the the facility that we use in Berkeley. They've sort of developed a number of image processing routines that were originally coded in Python. And so we've just sort of followed along in that kind of legacy of doing that. That's basically the answer there.
So I have a question. As you both know, Yale has created a configuration for use of AI kind of within the Yale system, in part to make sure that Yale generated activity isn't used to train models that operate outside of Yale. But some of your stuff is going outside that wall.
Yes.
Do you ever worry about your work being stolen, illegitimately used?
For me, I think I'm always sufficiently vague in using ChatGPT sort of outside of the Clarity sandbox, right?
Yeah.
That's hosted by Yale. And so instead of giving it a data set, right, a spreadsheet with all the measurements that we've made, I'll instead sort of describe what's in the spreadsheet. So I've got a CSV file with column headings of X, Y, and Z, and this is the type of statistical analysis I'd like to run on it. So I don't actually give it any of the data, and everything is sort of obscured. So I'm a little paranoid in that respect. It is interesting that I ran some of the models and sort of that network mapping in Clarity versus just regular old ChatGPT. And they gave me different answers, and I don't really understand why. And so each time you do it, it's always a little bit different, but they were sort of drastically different. And so I still don't understand sort of what's going on under the hood between the two systems.
Yeah, the problem is that the computer scientists don't know what's going on under the hood either. That's a fundamental problem with all of this is, I guess it's called explainability.
Yeah.
Do you run into these problems?
I mean, for the Clarity platform, I only use it to brainstorm some class activities or polish language. So
Oh.
I don't think that's the issue. And then for our own machine learning model, for those data generated, we always transparently disclose them when we publish the paper.
So
And if people want to use them, I would be very happy. That means our research are really valuable to the community. And we usually and if the journal has a requirement, some of journal even require to publish the code.
yeah,
And if they require that, we don't mind doing so. If more people can use our model to find it helpful, I think that's a kind of impact of our work.
right. Well, the question is before you publish, right? That's when the threat exists,
Yeah.
not after. Do you see in the short run, well, one of the things that's obviously happening in this realm is that AI is evolving at lightning speed. How do you keep up with the changes or the new opportunities? And do you anticipate that you might change what you're doing significantly in the near term because of that?
I think for us, the development of the image processing pipelines for dealing with all of this information, like it was not a thing, right? When we started, and over time, we realized that we've got this just enormous pile of data, and we now have this catalog of hundreds and hundreds of species. Each one of those we've had to go through and sort of manually do that set of training images for each one. And now we're at the point where I think we can sort of, instead of doing that, we've done training image data sets for enough species now where I think the goal is to basically get to the point where we don't have to do the training images anymore because we've created that database ourselves, which took a while. But we're at the point where I think we can just start feeding in all the new scans that come off of the instrument. Can now just go in and use the existing training, and it should be able to identify what species it is, or at least a closely related species, and then just by the training images that we've already produced. And so that's, I think, kind of where we're headed, is that we've sort of gotten over this initial hurdle of the manual sort of input and this very much guided sort of hand-holding sort of steps of training the system, and to the point where now I think we are sort of, this is where it really starts to pick up. And we can sort of process all of these, this back catalog in a very different way, as well as all the new data that we generate over the next few years. So I think that's sort of where we're headed with it.
Yeah.
How about you?
Similar to our biochar project, I think it's an initial step on collecting those data, cleaning those data, and put those data in a workable workflow that can use in the machine learning take the most of time. And then later, especially in the recent year, as machine learning get a faster development, we have better and faster algorithm, but it doesn't change the way we already built, like how we should use machine learning. And even those faster development AI doesn't change the fact that the challenging research questions in my field are still very challenging to answer. Because of many issues on data, many issues on our limited knowledge on how this nature works, they are still the limitation. The AI doesn't change that. Yeah. But for the new project where we try to understand the environmental burden of AI, I think that one will be affected as the AI development get this fast. But I assume that will be part of my collaborators, like electrical engineer and computer scientists, their job to tell me how those newly developed AI really change the infrastructure, change everything, how computer runs. But for ours, the fundamental methodology and the question we try to answer are still the same.
Ina?
Yeah, bear with me. Like, I think there's always a question of like the function versus the hazard of it, right? Like, we've established that like AI can serve a big function in academia, whereas like there are emissions that can be associated with it. There's sort of the design side of like, we had DeepSeek, which maybe like uses way less training data to get like a very similar model. Like there's the question of like, how do you do that better? But then there's also the use side of, you know, proper prompt engineering. Maybe we need to educate people on like how to create a good prompt and understand how AI works fundamentally. But then for academia, like, I just wonder in terms of like the question of how do you look at the environmental impact of AI? It always, so for your sorry, for your like surrogate model, Yuan, like I can imagine that's actually better than you know, doing millions of simulations. So like it's so context dependent, like when AI might actually be a better option as opposed to something else. You know, what's the functional unit here? Like how do you look into this?
Yeah. So actually, in this semester, in my life cycle assessment class, we have a student project. I'm working on AI, and my postdoc, Dr. Piao here, he's leading that project. We just have discussion with our guest speaker, a Harvard professor, coming last Friday about what is the functional unit we should define when we do assessment for AI. Should it be 1,000 token we take, the inquiry, or something else?
A flop, right?
Yeah, right? So that's a good question. We don't know because nobody have ever done a holistic assessment of the environmental impact of AI itself. And I think without really understanding what are the actual impact AI may generate, we would never know when is the best time to use AI compared to the traditional approach. So now I see, like as Reid mentioned, there are some literature published, but they are really not the holistic assessment because most of them are conducted by those people who do research in computer science or electrical engineer. They are not trained as the environmental scientist. While for us, like we industry ecologists, we are trained to do this assessment. We are not computer science and electrical engineer. We do not have those in-depth knowledge and really data, really understand what's happening in their side. So I think to answer those questions, a very close collaboration between those two fields, which very different, are needed to make sure those environmental impacts are assessed in a rigorous way and really reflect the actual environmental impact that may happen in the reality.
So most people working in this field say, well, there's a huge impact from training generative models. That will start to level out over time as it gets more sophisticated, and it'll be the inference, the application, because of the scaling effect, that even if it only uses a little bit, you multiply that by 1 billion uses in a day, which is what would happen if you attached generative AI to a Google search. That's where it is. And then you have this problem. Well, who's building that into their model? We did a search in the literature to see how many of the articles quantified the energy use or carbon impact in their analyses. We found a lot that were doing it, but they were only doing it like this, like this process or this training. I don't think we saw a single article that scaled. We saw a couple that took a full life cycle view. So it's wide open territory.
Yes.
Other question? Maryan, wait for the mic. The mic is still here.
Reid, this is for you because you're the political guy, right? There's just been tremendous concern about jobs and how when these how can you compete against these monsters, you know, and still be able to have a reasonable life. So I'm just wondering if you know more about that.
That's not the focus of my work. There was some work by economists who looked at this and said that the lower level professional workers, actually almost down to the clerical level, are going to benefit because they'll be able to do their jobs better, but they'll still be needed. And it's the next tier up, ironically, that will be hurt. But given how fast AI is evolving, I don't even know if that's still relevant. You know, the tech community was very keen on the basic income idea because they anticipate a lot of loss of jobs, but I'm not following the research in that area, so I can't speak with authority. Time to wrap it up. So the next class can get in here. So thank you very much.
Yeah.